What's the creepiest thing that's ever happened to you or someone you know? Serious. I was heading home from my mom's and was at a light next to a gas station when the person next to me told me there was something wrong with my tire. I pulled into the gas station, and when I saw the person follow me in, I felt something off, so I didn't get out. Instead, I called my mom on my cell phone, and when the guy pulled next to me, I gave him a thumbs up through the windshield. I then drove back to my mom's, which I had just left and was only a few minutes away. I get there, get out, we look at my tires and they are just fine. I'm a biologist that often has to do field work surveying unmaintained private properties in the middle of nowhere. Long story short, we find a body face up in a stream deep in a thickly wooded wetland. The body looked several months old, at least. No clothes, no tools, no shelter, nothing nearby to suggest who he is or how he got there. We couldn't even tell race or gender from what we saw. We call the police and they immediately tell us it's probably the missing person who ditched his car nearby. They apparently searched for weeks with dogs, horses, and ATVs but didn't find any sign of the guy. All they found was his family car loaded with cash and a handgun. They also tell us he seemed to be running from someone or something, real or imagined, they weren't sure. Apparently the man didn't even close his car door, just ditched it at a rail crossing and took off running into the woods in a tremendous hurry. I find his clothes about 30 yards up the stream bank from where the body was found. His pants were neatly folded and placed on top of his nice brown loafers, underpants and socks on top of those. He placed his glasses atop his socks, very orderly and in a nice pile. His shirt and undershirt were hanging from a tree branch right above those as if to dry. I mean, the whole thing creeps me out even a year on. But what unsettles me is the fact that he ran from his family, drove several hours from his home, ditched his car, and fought a mile through briars and thick woods only to stop and carefully fold and hang his clothes before meeting his end. I look him up every now and then and still can't find any more info about what happened or why. When I was a child in New Hampshire, I went exploring by myself and got lost in the woods. I was not worried about it in the least, and was just walking around. All of a sudden, I noticed someone standing about 25 feet away from me, and he was just standing perfectly still facing me. He was all bundled up in a bunch of shirts and jackets, one over the other, and his face was completely hidden by what looked like dirty rags. He was wearing big flat-lensed goggles. He just stood there staring at me. I stared back for a few seconds and then turned and ran. Maybe 30 minutes later I managed to find my way back to the edge of the lake, and was able to get back to where we were staying. I was at my uncle's house in some countryside with my sister and we were playing hide and seek. My uncle went out to buy some food for us. I was hiding downstairs in this weird closet/attic thing I found. I heard a little banging noise and got a little spooked. I then chalked it up to a little rat or something and continued to hide. I then heard a snore and a groan. I immediately got out and ran to my sister. We both sat at the door together, crying, until my uncle got home. My uncle just laughed it off and we were relieved. A decade later, an old man's dead body was found when my uncle tried to sell the house. It was revealed he was squatting there for almost a decade and he had written in a notebook how he was going to kill my uncle and keep the home for himself, and I think that would have happened if he didn't die. When I was around 9 we lived in Missouri. We had gone to St. Louis that day. When we got back around 8 o'clock, we lived far down in the south at a military base. The soldiers were doing firing drills and the gun noises was something we were used to. After a couple minutes, a random gun went off. We all assumed that it was a soldier who wasn't paying attention and accidentally fired or something. That next morning I was at school and I decided to walk through the woods home. I went with my friend Colin because he lived nearby and we found a basket in the woods. We opened it and found blood but nothing else. We ran home and told our parents. Turns out the police already got a call and had assumed it was a prank call cause nothing like that would ever happen. Later we found out an old lady had been shot, killed, and cut up and spread throughout the woods. Worst part. It was our teacher's sister and she'd been murdered by her son, who was also the art teacher. When my cousin was a teenager, maybe 18 or 19, she and her friends went out to party a lot. In my country you can legally start drinking with 16-18, so most teenagers start going to clubs at 16. Back then, hitchhiking was still pretty common and most teenagers did it to get home or to the city, since only very few had cars of their own. So my cousin and her friend want to go home after a night out and get picked up by a middle-aged guy. He's nice enough and they make small talk, while they drive. Suddenly, he takes a turn onto a remote road leading into the woods. He locks the car from the inside and his friendly facade falls. Instead he's suddenly tense, quiet and determined. My cousin's friend started crying quietly, but my cousin stays calm and starts talking to the man. She tells him about her family, her mom and dad, her brother and sister, and asks if he also has a family. When he tells her that he has a wife and 2 children, she asks for their names and how old they are, which school they go to, what their hobbies are, all while he drives them deeper into the woods. It must have triggered something, because after talking with him for a couple of minutes, he stops his car and breaks down. He starts crying and tells them that things are going well at home, that his marriage is pretty bad and he fears he'll lose his kids. My cousin comforts him during his breakdown and lets him spill his heart out. Eventually, he starts the car again, turns around and drives them home, saying he's sorry. They get out once they reach the street my cousin lived on, and when he drives off, my cousin sees him put a knife on the passenger seat that he had kept hidden next to him. They never hitchhiked again. TL, Doctor, my cousin and her friend almost got raped or worse while hitchhiking. When I was about 3 or 4, my parents were building a big house and the lead contractor was always extra friendly to me. My parents were always a little bit hands off, so I somehow ended up alone with the lead contractor in a half-finished house. I vaguely remember him and honestly don't know how long I was alone with him. My family always refused to say. Long story short, my mom caught him right as he was loading me into his truck and snatched me up while screaming at him, all while he's insisting he just wanted to buy your daughter candy at the store. They never reported him. I still can't understand why. Back in the early 90s, my sister took my nephew to a playground to play. When they were leaving, she noticed a man approaching her. He was well dressed in a suit, and seemed to be driving a beat-up pickup truck. He asked her if she could drive him to the gas station a few blocks up so he could call a tow truck, as his truck had broken down. She told him no, that would make her uncomfortable, but she would gladly stop at the gas station and call the tow truck for him. He started to insist it was only a couple blocks and he was already very late for work. Now feeling very uncomfortable, she said no again. He then got mad, really mad, and yelled at her, "I only wanted you to take me home." She noped right out of there, jumped in the car, backed up quickly, and rolled the window down just enough to say, "Don't worry, I'll call a police officer to help at the gas station," and sped off. She did stop at the gas station, call the police, and return to the park with the police officer. The guy and his truck were nowhere to be found. I had a pretty nasty stalker incident. It was a guy named Chris who was apparently really autistic. It was in the apartment complexes where I was at the time. He lived below me and would tell me I looked like a guy version of Ellen Page every time I came in contact with him. He started trying to get close with my friend, which led to him asking for my number to talk. I gave it and he'd usually just ask for music recommendations and normal stuff. Then out of nowhere he offers me $500 to jack off for him. I obviously say no and tell him to leave me alone, which then he starts sending me a bunch of pics of him cross-dressing. I get disturbed and tell him to lose my number and to leave me alone. He tells me I'm a horrible person and tells me some weird threats that I don't want to say, but I tell him I screenshotted them to show the police in case he tries anything else. I ended up leaving that state to live with my sister, and my friend Robbie stayed since that was his place. Chris apparently had a collage of a bunch of photos he took of me without knowing. He still asks about me to this day despite being 2 years ago, and my friend Robbie will jokingly tell me he's going to tell him where I moved. I know it doesn't sound super extreme, but it disturbed the hell out of me. I sleep in the basement. There's a rec room in the basement, with a fireplace in it. Often during the winters my father would tend the fireplace, and I could hear it from my room. So, one day, when I was sitting in my room, reading a book or something, I heard the scraping noise of my dad tending the fire. I heard the crackling of the fire, and my dad closing the door of the fireplace. I exited my room, planning on asking him for a can of Coke or something. But no one was there. The fireplace door was left open, and one of the tools used to tend the fire was laying on the floor. Suddenly everything felt colder. I ran upstairs and didn't go back down until I went to bed. The same thing happened again and again, even though I was the only one in the basement. I don't know what happened there, but do I really want to know? I met this girl who had done pretty serious mental issues. Don't know what all they were, but she was on income assistance and required to medicate. She decided we were destined to be together because we were born in the same year. She changed her phone number 4 times to trick me into answering because I screened her calls. She showed up at my work a couple times. She once decided to run away, hopped on a bus and rode 800 kilometers away before changing her mind. Texted me at 3 a.m. asking me to come pick her up because she didn't have return fare, or failing that, sent her some money. But this all pales in comparison to one of my friends. See, I was her second choice. She had a much bigger crush on this other guy. He was sharing a house with some other friends and it was kind of a communal hangout for a lot of people, so they didn't lock the door. She went over at like 2 p.m. on a weekday afternoon when everyone was at work and fell asleep in his bed. She also hid in some bushes near his car with a knife, and when he came by, she threatened to kill herself if he didn't give her a hug. He filed a police report after that one and may have got a restraining order. I knew a guy who was an archaeologist who worked with Native American sites. One year there was a lot of rain and after a mudslide, one of the other people working with him was driving along and saw a skull lying in the middle of the road. Apparently the rain washed out an old burial ground, and since grave digging is illegal, even if the grave isn't really buried anymore, they just had to bury the remains somewhere nearby. They consulted with the tribes whose ancestors had lived in that area, but none of them knew of any burial ground nearby, not surprising, since it was probably from hundreds or thousands of years ago, so they just kind of had to guess.